Thanks for coming on the show. And you're an interesting character. The first time I met you, and you're still interesting. So, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of just your background and how'd you get into where you are today?
You got it. I think when they say you're interesting for over time, they mean unpredictable, which is
Yeah.
probably the same as saying mentally ill. But that's between friends. What's a little mental illness?
Yeah,
Um,
we can never invite you over for a barbecue because we don't know where you're at.
you don't know what, yeah, you don't know what you're gonna get. I don't know what I'm gonna get. That's the fun. Man, it's good to see you. You asked me how I got to where I am. Well, so I guess I just start with where I am. My primary focus in big terms is advisory, risk advisory specifically. I'm typically focused on enterprise, large organization decision makers, that sort of clientele. The A lot of what I do is centered through enterprise security risk management, which is kind of taking a holistic approach to managing the risk of all of your business period, but business
Hmm.
processes. And the focus is on really, business continuity and throughout your organization. And that takes a different approach. Instead of setting up security kind of as an outside entity, it's imbuing the entire organization with risk management principles and getting leadership and decision makers bought in on the process of securing their own organizational responsibilities, but also fitting into a larger risk management profile. So I run a company called Contingency 3, and we also do some other things. We do some disaster response, particularly wildfires for the U.S. government, the primarily USFS, United States Forestry Service. So that's something that obviously we focus on from a business perspective, but as I'm sure we'll get into, the underlying purpose and strategy is really getting our teeth sharpened on disaster response
Right.
inside of the United States, so inside CONUS, what that looks like, how it's responded to, how the private sector will play a part in the response and stabilization efforts as we move forward. And I'm sure we'll talk about things like climate change, but really about what that really means on the ground and talking about adaptation and so forth. So I we focus globally. I'm sure I'll talk about my past, but primarily we're focused on the United States, Latin America, and
Right.
Asia, where I have
Hmm.
personal experience. But we have a global organization. We're a small but mighty band. But yeah, we look to be a force multiplier for decision makers, and to be able to and that includes obviously intelligence as it's called, but
Right.
really intelligence from the perspective of the reduction of uncertainty. So we kind of
Uh-huh.
use the mathematical definition of information, which is the reduction of uncertainty, and the true definition of intelligence is timely and relevant information. And so, in a nutshell, that's what I'm trying to do: is deliver timely and relevant reduction of uncertainty to leaders in what we call the decision making window that in our day and age is getting compressed every
Right.
day for people. So I didn't even answer your question, but I told you told you what I'm doing now. So I'll stop, let you get a word in edgewise. But yeah, that's what we're doing.
But yeah, do you find that, in this day and age, like the present time, that there's a need for your services, and there's just a lot of things going on in the world that we see, especially in the news. There's the flooding in Libya. There's unrest in San Francisco. There's just a lot of things going on, and companies are closing shop in big markets. You look at Nordstrom closing their flagship store in San Francisco. I mean, are those the kind of conversations that you're having with organizations prior to this happening, or have people reached out and say, "Hey, how do we handle this moving forward?"
Yeah, that's a good question. There are kind of a lot of ways to approach the answer. I think overall, yes, those are the kinds of some of the questions that we can help answer. Obviously, these days, using big data, using
Hmm.
quantitative analysis to drive decisions is we approach a lot of risk and a lot of these conversations from whether you look at it and you kind of divide it into strategic and tactical, what that means, or is it an existential risk like nuclear Armageddon or a big bad volcano or something like
Hmm.
that? Are we talking about theft in a city? And I think that scalability is absolutely uh, where we want to be. We want to be on the geopolitical conversation side,
Hmm.
the large strategy conversations about
Right.
directionality based on geopolitics and
Hmm.
other factors. And then, yeah, very much using quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis where I was going, using those both in what we call centaur teams. So think about a
Uh-huh.
centaur, you have the data in the back and the dude in the front, and that's
Right.
kind of how we look at it. We try to use both, and I think that's what most organizations are doing. But I think overall, one of the things that I always say is that I try really hard not to sell fear.
Hmm.
Fear is a great motivator, and sometimes
Right.
you need to, when it's the truth, you need to tell someone to be
Yeah.
afraid. But I think I like to preface the conversation with, look, there's always been disaster in the world. There's always
Right.
been theft in San Francisco. There's always been, and so part of the difficulty these days is separating the signal from the noise. And,
Mm.
that's
Well, what
everything
does that
from
mean?
what's that?
What does that mean?
So a lot of it is like topically.
Hmm.
So when you're dealing with, I'll just start here. So with signal, it used to be, let's take like you're a spy and you're in Cuba in
Right.
1957. And your job is to get out open source material, so
Hmm.
newspapers or whatever written in Cuba, and you need to get those to your smart folks in the analytical room
Right.
back at Langley or wherever.
Hmm.
And so that was your job, to sneak out this sort of information. And now, obviously, that's not the problem. Now the difficulty is not finding the needle in the haystack. It's the understanding that it is just a stack of needles, and
Uh-huh.
it can be very difficult, particularly on the topical level, where you have growing disinformation and misinformation, where it's intentional. AI and the part it's
Hmm.
playing in creating a diffusion of that, and an
Speaking of
explosion in
speaking of
that.
AI, did you see the Mission Impossible movie, the new one, the recent one?
I have not. I haven't. No,
Yeah,
I haven't seen it yet.
basically AI takes over the world. So,
Well, I
it's
mean,
yeah.
those are conversations. So those are the kinds of conversations we have
Hmm.
with leaders as well. Is what is the reality of AI, and
Right.
oftentimes, I think a lot of it is, and I think this is the central point that I want to make in all of these conversations about managing risk, which is we are truly living in the future. And what I mean by that is that there's no human society in our rearview mirror who's had to make decisions that we are currently having to make. And that's a bigger deal than you would expect. Human beings like patterns, they like consistency.
Right.
And for thousands of years, if you woke up on a Tuesday and walked outside, it was just like it was 100 years before and 100 years in the future.
Right.
And these days, we are working with very old software called our brains, based
Hmm.
on a context called, like the savannah and a hunter
Right.
gatherer type. And now we're being forced to make decisions, and again, very compressed timescales that affect hundreds of thousands of people, some
Hmm.
of the decision makers that we work with, and or more. And so the question is that how do I prepare a leader? Because it's not my job to come in and give them the right answer. It's
Right.
to prepare them. I might, but really what I'm
Hmm.
trying to do is to prepare them and be a good source of not only verified information, which
Uh-huh.
is, again, in a world of disinformation, is key. What can I trust and who can I trust? And then
Hmm.
trying to, at most, give, or at minimum, I should say, is to give the constraints to their decisions and the imperatives to their decisions, right?
Hmm.
So you want to get from A to B, this is what has to happen. You want to have manufacturing in Brazil? Well, you're going to have to put a manufacturing unit in Brazil. And then
Right.
how you get to that, what are the constraints to that? And that's where it really gets into, localized data. Like, look, the crime here on this corner where you want to put your manufacturing is significantly worse than over here, or what have you. Now, the issue with that is, as much as we want to trust big data, particularly within the security world, the problem is that you're only as good as your data. And so as more and more nations and states in the United States, or even localities, stop producing good, say, crime data or good data, then the analytical value of that goes down. And so what I see is that, although, again, big data is very important, if you can't keep your data clean, you're back in the same boat where you're using a person, either human intelligence or analytical capacities through qualitative capacities to be able to derive directionality. So I think there's that's really what I enjoy doing, is engaging in complex problem solving, and deep conversations about how, for an organization, how they meet their overall mission and objective. And again, that can be very strategic, and that can, hey, we need to move supply chains from China to Mexico. I may have to tell them there's no possible way to do that based on these factors, right? And then, in very tactical terms, as we've discussed, where should I put my store? Or should I shut down my store in these cities? Is a question that comes up, quite a bit. So
and then there's also the the idea of profitability, right? You might present some solid solution, but then comes down to cost, and then is the organization willing to spend that to solve the problem they're dealing with, right? 100%. Do you ever run into that?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think that one of the difficulties in being both a trusted risk advisor and then also selling services is that, that's the difficulty. Your job is to be the advisor to the leadership and to give good advice over time. And it's, it's not about picking up nickels on short-term engagements for cost, because look, most organizations look at security as a necessary evil. It has a lot of problems. It's hard to prove a negative. If you have a store and you have a guy outside, how do you know that's the reason you didn't get robbed? And so when you're having conversations about money, particularly in a situation where we are now, where companies got nervous and are nervous about a recession, or even in the Pacific Northwest specifically, how do they make those decisions? Can be very complex and very expensive. And so what we find a lot is that I often, unfortunately, get called in to solve a problem that's already manifested. And then the leadership has difficulty controlling cost, because they need the problem solved, and it can be very expensive to clean something up, rather than the money spent to protect yourself and to minimize, the basic equation of risk. And you know your threats, minimize your vulnerabilities, and be prepared to mitigate when those two meet and deal with the consequences. And so that conversation for decision makers, particularly in the current financial environment, I get it. It's difficult. They're like, okay, I'm going to spend this money to protect my organization, but that fire hasn't happened yet, and I've got actual fires I need to put out. And so that's why, for me, it really is early on, particularly talking about setting the hedges for their decision making as best as I can, with the thought that, one side of the hedge are the threats that you face, and here are your vulnerabilities. Here's the context you find yourself in, and here's how you can protect yourself or minimize the probabilities, because that's all we're doing, is playing the probabilities game. How do we lessen your probability, minimize your probability of an attack, whether that's physical or cyber? So it's human decision. It's humans. It's how they make decisions. We're much more reactive to a problem. It's hard. So those conversations, and again, to bring it back, in order to be trusted, you have to respect the fact that person who's making that decision knows their organization, is responsible for that organization, and they're going to spend money where they think they need to spend money. I'm just the guy trying to tell
Right.
them, hey, let's prepare for, particularly now, a changing world. Again, the world's always changing, but I would say an escalated changing world. We're in the future, and how to prepare for that.
Right.
And sometimes that's as simple as just these kinds of conversations, talking about their day to day, and what they're facing and what keeps them up at night. It's always my first question. When the last thing you think of and the first thing you think of with relationship to your organization or business, what keeps you up? What are you worried about that maybe no one else knows? And then you can really get into the heart of what can and cannot be done, and how to essentially minimize their cost, and at the same time build a program, a foundation for them to be able to respond and not react to a threat if it makes it inside the hen house. And those are really, really fun conversations to have.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you're talking, it's very similar to what I do for clients, is just, trying to project them into the future with potential challenges they may face or opportunities, and they have to make a decision today or some point soon to address everything that they've said they wanted, right? So they, in your world, it's, I want to protect my business, and the problem hasn't happened, but then I have to do these things today to prevent that. But then, I'm sure you find organizations that just kind of, it's like, oh, that's great, let's just put it off, call me back next year, whatever, right? And, I ask pretty much the same question: what keeps you up at night, right? What would you say keeps most leaders of large organizations up at night? Like, what's the common thing you hear?
The unknown.
The unknown.
And that's where it gets really difficult, because I think that is the world we're finding ourselves in. The pie of unknown is growing.
Right.
More and more is unknown. More and more is less predictable, based on, again, pattern behavior of how the supply chains worked over the last 30 years during globalization. That's no longer occurring. I saw that in spades during the pandemic and some of the work we were doing, just watching entire trust networks collapse because there was no real trust. It was just in time supply chains, and it was either you pay or you didn't. And then when that got disrupted, so the unknown is what keeps, I think it's the driver of all anxiety.
Right.
It's that worry about. And so
that's
a good question.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but when you say unknown, is there like a way you can compartmentalize that and say the unknown in, the human aspect of filling the workforce, the unknown of natural disasters, the unknown of you have a new competitor that comes into the market and just disrupts everything? So
I think yes. I think typically, those are the things, but then I think you have added unknown. What are the probabilities of a hurricane hitting my manufacturing base? What is the probability this year of a hurricane hitting oil production in the Gulf of Mexico? What is the increase in street security that is necessary around our stores with the elections that are coming up in 2024 and all of the tension that is involved? And so when I say unknown, a lot of it is, yes, we can definitely break into buckets, very big ones, physical security, cyber security. You can break it into, for a global organization, geopolitical, how's the war in Ukraine affecting decision-making in Minneapolis? How does that affect supply chains, which is chains, which is, again, they're just in time, spread over every country imaginable, hundreds and hundreds of nodes, that sort of thing. So breaking it into those things, but those probability, that risk is what organizations are and leaders are geared to deal. That's how they got to be a CEO. Right. They know how to manage. And so where a lot of the conversation is the risk that, again, is in the future.
Right.
Hard, but it is about things like these days, a lot of conversations are things about global war and climate change and elections and, elections have always kind of been on the docket,
Yeah.
but in big terms and in places like the United States and states within the United States, am I going to be able to work with the local government? Am I,
Hmm.
that, so I think that those unknowns where they don't have a playbook, there's no book to go read from some general in the past. There's no business leader
Right.
in 1977 who dealt with, for example, like AI.
Right.
So conversations about like, look, I think I can replace my entire workforce with AI right now, and
Uh-huh.
then talking about all of the impacts that would occur there, and the trust you're putting in AI, and these sorts of even decisions where like things look like
Hmm.
AI looks like a savior. Hey, I'll save 30% of revenue. It'll turn into profit because I don't need folks to write,
Right.
short copy for marketing or whatever.
Hmm.
But believe it or not, a lot of leaders are interested in how that creates more instability in the overall system.
Uh-huh.
Because I mean, if you force all your shoppers out of business,
Yep.
that can be problematic for everyone. And so it is really
Hmm.
interesting for me and for our company about just how broad and how we can, again, depending on what the organization is and what the goals are and what market they're in, we're having these large level conversations trying to determine how exposed they are to, say, existential risk to the
Hmm.
business, but then getting very, very tactical on the ground, for very basic conversations. So not trying to avoid your question entirely, but
Yeah.
it really can be organizational and industry specific and location specific. And so what I'd like to say is that really what I mean by the unknown is we know that, for example, that whether it's climate change or the fact that people are now living in areas where they haven't they
Hmm.
haven't done fire suppression in 15 years, and now there's a
Yeah.
million people in the area, and so the infrastructure is destroyed. Really, the difficulty is for them, for
Hmm.
leadership, is understanding that these problems exist. That's the first step. Now, where the
Yeah.
unknown is the when and where. So, for
Right.
example, could anyone have guessed that where it would pop off from a civil unrest perspective would have been Minneapolis specifically, or
Uh-huh.
Kenosha? It could have been numerous places.
Right.
And so that is where the decision makers really have a tough spot, because yes, they see all these new risks, these increased risks for things that could affect their business, but the when and where, that is the definition of unknown, is when and where will it happen, and then what resources do you have. And so they have to be to respond. And so
Hmm.
that could be different in Seattle, Washington, or in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Your just ability to respond to
Uh-huh.
threats. So you see that a lot. You see that a lot being very concerning. Like, okay, we're going to prepare for this, but how do I prepare for this on a global level? And then a typhoon hits, the Pacific, and
Yep.
you weren't prepared for that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
that
you didn't build a building that can withstand a typhoon or whatnot, right? Because you're focused on other things like cost,
yep,
right?
yep, yep,
As opposed to
yep.
building a concrete building. So,
I think that's right. I think that in that sort of probability, risk probabilities, that
hmm.
you're making a decision on what type of materials you build your building, where um, all of those things are these little small decisions that build up to your resiliency. And so that's why oftentimes working with large established clients to say, hey, we need to develop, SOP, standard operating procedures, to
Hmm.
respond to active shooter events. And then you
Hmm.
say, okay, well, where are you? And they are spread throughout the United States. Well, you almost have to have programs developed to teach this stuff, or you should,
Uh-huh.
for each population, because everyone responds to something like guns
Right.
differently, or the use of violence,
Hmm.
or how many people are probably got a gun in their pickup truck out in the parking lot. And then all of these kind of these questions are really, really relevant, and that's very difficult,
Right.
when you have all of these problems, but then also you're having to solve them on very local levels. It's not an easy task. And so decision makers have to determine where they're going to spend the money and
Hmm.
what is most relevant to, it's just like fighting. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I can stop his wrestling, but that means I'm open for the hooks. So I'm
Yeah,
going to do all I
or a
can,
knee.
or the knee.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna do everything I can to not get hit with that, but I have to accept that I have increased vulnerability because I'm doing X, Y, or Z in defense.
Hmm.
And so I think both of us, we really use that, fighting and MMA as kind of a touchstone for even how we would describe what we do. And a lot of it is that, okay, you're going, for us as well, we're not just looking to be defensive in our services. We
Right.
also want to be offensive.
Yep.
So how do you take advantage of these vulnerabilities in others or the vulnerability in the market or, what have you? And so it is an interchange between from a defensive conservative posture,
Hmm.
you're able to attack in a more defensive way and to not and to minimize the risk of that offensive opportunity. And again, these are
Hmm.
long-term conversations and long-term strategic builds that organizations need to make. And I think for a while, particularly in our neck of the woods in the Northwest, a lot of the tech leadership had the idea of, move fast and break things. That's great when you're
Hmm.
developing software. That is not so great, in my opinion, when you're developing an organization where people come to work every day and they're relying on you for some measure of security while they're there and safety and
Hmm.
support. And they feel safe if they're traveling for your mission, to
Yep.
countries that could provide more danger to them. So it's that interchange of getting sometimes high speed decision making entrepreneur risk takers by nature. So that's the
Right.
thing. A lot of what we deal with is they're like, yeah, okay, I'll take that risk. And you have
Yeah.
to say, okay, what's the liability of that risk, not just for you, but for everyone else.
Hmm.
And that's another conversation that we're constantly trying to drive. But these guys, men and women, are willing to really risk things for success. And but at the same time, yeah, how do we put you on a solid footing to be able to do that? Which
Yeah.
is what I think insurance obviously is
Hmm.
is a big component of that as well.
No, insurance, and even going back to the mixed martial arts. We both been in mixed martial arts for a long time. You're a jiu-jitsu black belt, right? And it gives you the fundamental mindset of how do you be defensive but also offensive at the same time, right?
Yes.
And when you think about mixed martial arts, it prepares you for almost any type of battle, right? And when you look at it, the market itself, whether in financial planning or in risk management, you have to think about all the possible ways the opponent can win, right? And then you mitigate those ways, right? You,
Yep.
you address those risks, and at the same time, if you want to be offensive, you have the confidence to be offensive, right? So if an organization has all the risk management in place, they have the ability to be more aggressive in their marketing, their expansion or whatnot, because if they know that if shit goes south, they have backstops, right?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it is, it's in our name,
Right.
having contingency plans and really consistently thinking about resilience. And, from a fighting perspective, well, it's interesting whether I'm, teaching grappling in an MMA context or we're teaching a response class
Hmm.
with some of our training with tactical shooting and so forth, or you're talking to business leaders about their organization. I it's really interesting to me how it always comes down to basic principles of
Hmm.
combat
Right.
and that mindset. And so mindset for me, whether you're talking about it in say a combat situation
Hmm.
where you can do all the shooting in the world you can do. You can go to every shooting house that you want, take every training. But do you truly have, and you have to answer this for yourself,
Hmm.
oftentimes without truly experiencing, do you really have the ability to perform a violent act? Can you
Right.
really be
Right.
violent? And in what situation and what context? So I would never attack a man who's not attacking me.
Right.
So my entire posture in the street or at work or in a denied environment
Mm-hmm.
is really that, is the idea that I'm focused on ambush and
Mm-hmm.
counter ambush, because that's the only way that I'm getting into something is someone's jumped me or
Right.
someone has ambushed me.
Mm-hmm.
So but in order to be able to do that, it has to be reliant on my mindset, meaning that when I see something and I'm able to analyze and articulate to myself, if I have the time, that is a threat. Of course, the first thing I want to do, and the best defense, is just not to be there. Avoid.
Yep.
Mitigation comes when you cannot avoid. And so if I can avoid it, cross the street, go into a restaurant, talk the guy down with a good old boy accent. Hey man, we're okay, whatever it takes. Then if it does pop off, I know that I can articulate very clearly that guy came at me. Yeah. And I think organizations as well is like that sort of mindset of, what am I really capable of doing? What do I really have the skills to do? Like, do I really have the skills to and the resources to do what I say I'll do? And do I honestly think I can press the button when the button needs to be pressed in time and in line? And those are what I really try to challenge leaders with, or folks that just want to, learn martial arts. And so, yeah, I find that connection throughout all of the work that I do.
Right. How did you get into martial arts?
Dudes like you were bullying me. When I was a kid, I think I was always into it. I trained all the things everybody else trained. It was Taekwondo or Kung Fu, what have you. But I never really fell in love with it. And then I was
for some reason I can't picture you doing like a triple backspin.
I mean, you should see it. So I got in a lot of fights when I was a kid. Grew up fighting. That's not neither good nor bad, but I definitely always liked a good scrap. And so I think as I got older, obviously, hopefully the street fighting days were behind me. And so
you have other people to do that.
In 2007, I moved to China. I was in China, Beijing, and there was a place there called Black Tiger, and it was run by a guy named Chet Quint on the jiu-jitsu side. He's a Pedro Sauer black belt. Just a amazing guy. I think he was former Marine. I don't think he was in the Army. And then also Miami-Dade PD, I think. And so he had a really practical sense. And then Vince Soberano, who's big time over in Asia now for a lot of more of kickboxing and so forth. But they were running this gym called Black Tiger. I honestly was like, you know what? I think I'm gonna go take a kung fu lesson. And then I saw an ad in one of the Beijing English magazines for this place, a tiny little ad, Black Tiger. I thought I'd go check it out. And like everyone, I'm a big guy, and so I go in there and they're like, hey, why don't you try out a jiu-jitsu class?
Yeah.
And I did, and promptly got my butt handed to me in ways that I can't even describe or believe. By a purple belt time named Stephen Wander, who's actually from the Seattle area. And he just beat me up. And I just recognized, like, I have to learn this. And so that was the first response. And then very shortly, and particularly because Beijing was interesting at the time, you had a lot of embassy folks, a lot of Dutch kickboxers and Israeli tough guys and Russian dudes from the embassy. You didn't know what they were doing, but they were there to train. And it was this real mix of guys looking for real martial arts and combat. And we found it, and I just fell in love. I mean, I think pretty immediately I fell in love with specifically grappling and the intellectual intricacies of high level grappling, and then striking obviously is a practical tool, and then the mixing of them. So yeah, I think once that happened, there were a few years there where, I'm one of those guys that say, I'm not quite sure jiu-jitsu didn't save my life. There were weeks when I'd come back from some pretty tough engagements where, or months, I should say, where I mean, I
Hmm.
just train to exhaustion every day,
Right.
and
Kind of
so
help you
yeah,
take your
that
mind
was
off
my
things too.
what's that?
Yeah, kind of take help you take it your mind off things.
It's I can't. I think that that's the thing. I think if you don't do it, it's hard to describe. It's like it's everything. It is.
Yeah.
There's no harder workout, isometric workout than grappling. There's no tiredness like that tiredness that I've ever found. And
Hmm.
I've done everything from adventure guiding in the mountains of South America to you name it, and I looked for that kind of exhaustion. So I think on the physical side of things, it's just a phenomenal workout.
Right.
I think the other end of it is that I always joke around. It's like, but it's true. Is Tony, like you and I, we met and developed a friendship on the mats
Yep.
because I joke, but it's true. Is like it's like the physical intimacy that we show each
Yep.
other on the mat. I mean, essentially, we're dudes in underwear laying on top
Yeah.
of each other. I don't care how you want to put it, and it's almost like it's okay because there's violence involved.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
hey, we're gonna have this intimate engagement, but I'm
Right.
trying to hurt you, so it's okay.
Try to choke this guy
And
out.
yeah, exactly. But I'm trying to choke you out. So it's like,
Yeah.
so I think that the camaraderie, and I know guys get it in
Hmm.
golf clubs and tennis, but the camaraderie and the trust that develops with guys who could hurt you
Yeah.
and don't, is hard to describe. And I think, and I'm not the one who's come up with this, but I think more than anything, for example, particularly the world I inhabited, where you didn't know who to trust and for how
Hmm.
long.
Yeah.
There's no lying on the mats.
Yeah.
You can't lie to me. You can tell me whatever you want. We touch hands and we touch each other, and I feel your strength and I
Yep.
feel your skill and your talent. And that was so refreshing to just have honest relationships
Right.
with dudes that there's no lying.
Yeah.
You know
I
who
mean,
you
it's
are.
like I know you can beat me. You know that I can beat you. So it's like stuff like that, right? Where it's like the truth comes out. You can't bullshit
Absolutely.
your way through fighting.
No, there's no bullshit.
Yeah.
I would make it a requirement that everybody's a purple belt in jiu-jitsu. I believe
Yeah.
the world, I'm one of those guys that believes the world would be a much, much better place if everybody had to be a purple belt.
Right.
I think that it does. Now, look, like we know, martial arts can also make ego monsters. It doesn't
Oh, yeah.
necessarily destroy the ego, but if you approach it correctly, and again, I think a lot of this has to do with mindset. I think it's one of the things that's kind of lost in MMA gyms a lot of times now is it's very focused on the martial art and not the mindset and the emotional and mental development necessary to actually have and use those skills appropriately. So I have issues with that, but I do think overall, and particularly at high level stuff, it's like what Helio Gracie said. You can't lie to me for 10 years. Why does it take 10 years to get a black belt? Because you can't lie to me for that long.
Yeah.
Right. Now we just said, meaning you can't keep anything from me. I will know exactly who you are by the time I belt you. And that is I just love those aspects of martial arts. And it's why at almost 50 years old, I just can't quit it. I will always train somehow, some way. Because I just feel like I get so many benefits beyond learning how to do a cross collar choke appropriately.
Yeah, I'm thinking of doing some grappling tournaments, and I'm learning that there's a bracket for everybody. Whether you're 50, 60, you can still compete. And I saw a clip of some ladies grappling, and they must have been well into their 60s at a tournament, right? So it
gives me hope. Right?
It's really for everyone.
Yeah. And I think that that's where for me, being a big guy, there's no lying. Being bigger, strength matters.
Yeah.
Size matters. You're lying if you say it doesn't. And but as I get older, as I get into my 50s here shortly, I think that that's the ego burn, is recognizing I'm not that guy anymore.
Right.
I don't have the tank I used to have. I don't. Eventually, my fast twitch fibers will go.
Take longer to warm up.
Yeah, I'll just be. I mean, we're all headed there, and I think that when you're involved in something like jiu-jitsu, you just get a notice much earlier than most people. Because again, you can't lie. I've been grappling with some guys forever, and now I go grapple with some of these young kids, and I'm just like, I got 3 or 4 rounds, and then get off.
Yeah,
I'm done, man.
Or say, oh, I got a meeting, I got to go.
Yeah. And I spent 18 of the 20 minutes on top, and I'm the tired one. I mean, so yeah, for me, the humbling aspects
Mhm.
of martial arts, and frankly, when you see a martial artist and experience a martial artist like Demetrius Johnson, and you truly recognize there are levels to this
Mhm.
game, I think that can be very humbling as well. I mean, I've had the honor of not just training with him, but training with some world champion level
Right.
guys, or even guys not world champion, just
Yeah.
on that way. And good night. I mean, yeah. I think that is another aspect, is that the guys out there that we're able to meet that don't care how big I am, they're going to tie me up into a little
Mhm.
knot, and that's also humbling, but extremely fun because of the intellectual. Uh, you don't ever think as much as after you just got your ass
Yeah.
handed to you on the mat. Hours of just like, I should have done this.
Right.
And I
Well, I
really
shouldn't
love
have let him sit on top of me the whole time.
that.
But then there's
That's
just
all
no
I'm
way
doing,
out.
baby. Just
There was no way
lay
out.
and pray. Lay and pray. Yeah, that's it. That's my entire game.
So how did what? I know that you're on your way to become a professional ball player, right? Baseball. How did you make that switch from baseball player to on this trajectory of the business you're in?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. When I say that, it's like there was a moment there. So I played baseball at Texas A&M
Mhm.
University, where there was just a ton of talent, to put
Right.
it mildly. And I didn't have the career that I wanted to have. I had mechanic issues, and then I had arm issues.
Mhm.
And as I've always said, I mean, I've had the pleasure of being around some world class athletes, and a lot of world class athletes I know that nobody else knows, because injuries are what does a lot of
Mhm.
guys in,
Yep.
obviously. And so for me, though, I think that I got to a point where my senior year, really starting in my junior year, actually when I kind of got to A&M, because I played
Mhm.
2 years at a smaller college, I started to have significant arm trouble. And by my senior year, I just wasn't the same guy.
Right.
My velocity was way down. I mean, I learned to write right-handed, because the day after I pitched, I couldn't
Mhm.
pick up my arm. And so when it ended, it was a relief,
Uh-huh.
because in that view, you start to recognize what I thought I was going to be my whole life, was a professional athlete. You
Mhm.
start to recognize, at least in that sport, that that's not going to be happen.
Right.
And there was some sadness there, but then there was a real kind of awakening of, there's so much more I want to do with my life, because
Mhm.
all I had done since I was 5 years old was to compete in some sporting event. I mean, I played it out. You name it, I played it.
Right.
And it was my whole life. And so when that ends, I'm glad it ended for me young. My cousin Kevin Garner was, I think, the 10th pick in the draft by the San
Mhm.
Diego Padres. Played at University of Texas. Was an All-American. He may have had a cup of coffee in the pros, but he never made it. And then he was about 30 when I was starting to play at
Right.
A&M, and I just recognized I didn't. A lot of injuries he had to deal with. A lot of, in the minor leagues
Mhm.
are no fun. I mean, you'd
Right.
be on a bus for years, and it was just this recognition that, hey, this is over, but
Uh-huh.
I think there's more to life than this. I'm pretty sure there is more to life than throwing a white ball.
Right.
And so that transition, when I got out, I was looking for everything I could to compete in. I thought about triathlons. I thought, you name it, I just want to compete,
Mhm.
because that's what you miss:
Right.
camaraderie and competition when you leave that kind of environment. But yeah, I put baseball in the rearview mirror pretty quickly, and I think when I graduated college, how this whole tale started. I ended up in Europe,
Mhm.
and at one point ended up in Bosnia, and this was about 2000, and so a lot of conflict there, and I
Mhm.
think my life changed.
Right.
Really, somewhere around Dubrovnik, Croatia, I decided that I wanted to take a different path.
Mhm.
Seeing that sort of human suffering and conflict
Yeah.
is such a eye opener. I tried to sneak into Bosnia and got turned around at the barrel of a gun.
Right.
Apparently, I was a naive idiot and did not know that taking a taxi into Sarajevo was frowned upon.
Right.
So but I had this huge wake up call,
Mhm.
And then I guess kind of you asked me about my past. That really is what led me really not to security. That I was looking to do development work
Mm-hmm.
and development work in conflict zones more specifically.
Right.
So yeah, I think baseball honestly was not a difficult transition because
Mm-hmm.
it's like, if you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm not the guy I was before,
Uh-huh.
then, I didn't want to go is what they call, like, I didn't want to go for a pack of peanuts, basically a
Uh-huh.
contract where they fly you over and give you a rookie contract and try to make it
Yeah.
work. So it wasn't difficult. It wasn't difficult for me.
Nice. Now, you also work for a hedge fund, right?
We did some I've done plenty
Mm-hmm.
of due diligence investigations for investors of all types.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of my personal experience and personal relationships, specifically, I spent, as I said, almost 5 years in Latin America,
Mm-hmm.
spent a couple years in Europe, spent 5 years in China.
Right.
So those personal relationships are in the kind of institute, the local knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that I have, and the networks I have there, trusted networks I have there, is a real value
Mm-hmm.
for those trying to make investment decisions. Now, again, a lot of times I get called in when something's a little shady. So
Right.
someone's trying to invest in a coal field in Mongolia and they've
Uh-huh.
hired a Chinese company to do the due diligence. They get a
Uh-huh.
report that's like, yes, there's a coal field. And, investors get a little squirrely. They ask me to go look and no, there's no coal, there's
Right.
sheep.
Yeah.
And you're about to invest $300 million into sheep.
Right.
That kind of stuff. But again, it's that decision-making
Mm-hmm.
protocol of a lot of folks, and this is the difficulty because it's not me saying to leaders like, hey, like an investor.
Right.
That's what he does for a living. It's not my job to say, I know what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't know your business or you don't know your investment protocols. What I try to say sometimes is, hey, I can build a red team analysis. I can counter your logic here, here, and here. And what I would say is look at the facts on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
verified facts on the ground.
Right.
You decide how that affects your decision-making
Yeah.
process. I can give you the analytical findings if that's
Mm-hmm.
what you want, or I can give you what we're finding in pure collection format.
Right.
And then you can make those decisions. And I don't need to know
Mm-hmm.
what you're making those. And I think, so for that, a lot of, again, due diligence, joint venture stuff, I would tell anyone who's going to do a business deal with anybody else these days, there's
Mm-hmm.
enough data online. You should do some research.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we all like to operate. All of us like to operate on human relationships,
Mm-hmm.
connection. Hey man, I just like that guy.
Right.
And my challenge is to say there are plenty of people out there who are trained to make you like them.
Mm.
They've done their research. And so that warm fuzzy feeling you're having, that's intentional. And I need you to take a step back and look at what we're finding about this individual and think about whether or not you really want to move forward with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like that, a lot of times there are leadership that is concerned about destroying the trust there. Well, I don't want them to think I don't trust. So you can obviously do it covertly.
Yeah.
But I never quite understand the argument because if I'm going to do a business deal with you, I think it's open the kimono time.
Yeah.
For what's relevant. Like, hey, transparently, here's what's on the table. And
Mm-hmm.
if you want to verify these facts I'm giving you, that's great. Because I'm telling you the truth and you will develop trust.
Yeah.
Because you'll know that what I've told you is true. So there are a lot of reasons why leadership will not do that. Oftentimes
Mm-hmm.
they just feel like they can trust their gut. But again, I
Do
think when
do you find that that's more of a human nature rather than a business decision?
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. People don't want to believe they're being played.
Right.
No one wants to believe that they can be played. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just here to tell you, we can all get got. And I think when you understand that also your read on someone does not take into account, that you're going to do a deal in Singapore, you meet the guy, you have a great time,
Mm-hmm.
You get drunk together, he passes the drunk test. He's not the different guy when he's drunk, whatever book you've read that tells you how to, determine whether or not you're going to move forward with someone. You have to understand that maybe when you leave, he gets a visit because his mom lives in Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
He gets a visit from someone, asks him out for what we call a cup of tea.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, hey, your mom's living a good life in Beijing,
Right.
and we'll be checking up on her, and we'll ask you here and there what's going on.
Uh-huh.
You can't understand the pressures that other people are experiencing, other partners are
Right.
experiencing, and at the end of the day, it's on you and your responsibility to make sure that you're doing business with the people you think you're doing business with, and understanding the context that they find themselves, because it's not always their decision. They're compromised.
Right.
They don't want to do what they're about to do, but they don't have a choice, at least in their own mind. And at the highest levels of decision making, I mean, you have to understand there are nation states that make no differential between national intelligence and corporate intelligence. That's a false dichotomy. Your economy is your country in a lot of ways.
Right.
And so, countries like Israel or France or China, they don't make any distinction. And when you think about the level of technologies these days and being able to collect intelligence on your opponents, or whether it's your adversary or your partner, and the ability to manipulate through information services, it's just, and you realize that where do all these old spooks go when they leave national service,
right?
And you understand that you're actually playing a very serious game. And what I find is most decision makers simply cannot accept that there's someone who would be targeted. And that is the biggest hurdle. And that's where I have to walk the line between selling fear.
Right.
You are absolutely a target, ma'am. And that balance of that, hey, you should be afraid here. You have a product that nation states absolutely want to get their hands on, earlier the better. And the way in which they're going to do that is they're not going to approach you directly.
Right.
They're going to approach, as we say, like degrees of separation. It's your wife's tennis partner that gets approached by a national intelligence operative. It's your babysitter. It's not you. They often, unless you're just, you're a joke, and you're doing all the stupid things. You're going home with women you don't know at bars and leaving your phone on. Yeah, I mean, they go straight to the source, but oftentimes it's those degrees of separation and the trust factors you need with those people, and do you really trust the people that are close to you?
Right.
These are very uncomfortable questions. They get familial, which is never easy. And yeah, oftentimes it's amazing how many times someone like a decision maker, a CEO's wife or son, or if it's reverse, husband will say, I'm over it. I'm scared.
Right.
We were just in the news. Our address was published. I want security. And, but I get that despite the fact we all believe all these leaders are narcissists and psychopaths, they're not. And they just don't have the self-belief that China would target me, or the United States would target, or wherever they're at, that a nation state would be interested in what they're doing.
Right.
So that's a big hurdle to climb psychologically, you find.
I feel like you find a lot of folks in this area that, they're very unassuming. They show up at a fancy restaurant with Birkenstocks and a sweater vest.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But they run a big technology organization that provides data. Right. So somebody like that, and they're just walking around town.
Yep. And walking around town with their Bluetooth on their phone. When they go to the bathroom, they leave the phone on the table because they're with friends. They're dropping personal identification information all over the place. They don't realize, they're talking to the waiter about where they're going next, and what have you. And look, I get it. I mean, there is this constant tension between comfort and security.
Right.
If you think about it, it's not comfortable to be like, ooh, I can't have this conversation. And also, a lot of leaders already feel separated from the rest of humanity. They're the boss, and so in their little world, and so everyone treats them that way. And so a lot of them are just really, really interested in human connection. They want to make that human connection. Well, how do you make human connection? Well, you make it through trust, right? You tell some about you, I tell some about me, that kind of thing, and that's how we build a relationship. And so some of the hardest part as well for them is understanding that they're no longer in that position,
Mm-hmm.
and that they are now in a, again, it's lonely at the top. These cliches are real,
Right.
and they have to, while in that role, they have to be subservient to that role. You are the president of this company, you are the CEO of this venture firm. You are not Mary, you're not
Mm-hmm.
Bob. That's
Right.
not who you are. And so while you have that role, you have in your hands the fate of possibly thousands of people or the US economy. I mean, who are you? You know, are
Mm-hmm.
you Tim Cook?
Right.
And so I think that is the hard part. Like, you know, guys like Tim Cook, Bill Gates, they know, right?
Right.
Somebody with a government pin on their leg came and said, we need to talk
Yeah.
about your services and your threat.
Right.
It is the ecosystems of these companies, for example, and Microsoft knows it.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that if someone's going to get in, it's going to not be probably a blue. It might be a contractor
Mm-hmm.
who is on campus or working with systems, and they have access to things they shouldn't have access to, or you know, and because there is always a financial incentive, you're always going to have employees who are disgruntled or unhappy with the
Mm-hmm.
way they were treated, or whether it's true or not. And leaders really, really struggle with the fact that Jimmy is in his basement thinking about how to get you back,
Right.
and then Jimmy's identified by an adversary, and they're like, "Hey, Jimmy, for $5,000, will you walk out the
Mm-hmm.
IP for this new product?" It's
Yeah.
easy. It's not highly complex, and and so the next thing that happens, the leader hears that, and then they realize the scope of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you have to actually do something about it. And again, all of these decision trees are difficult because it really is about changing the perspective about who you are, about your value,
Right.
what your value means in geopolitical terms,
Mm-hmm.
and really understanding what you are actually threatened by, and trying to live again within those constraints. Have a good life, enjoy life. But
Mm-hmm.
again, you've decided to be a CEO of a company or a venture firm or what have you, a venture capital firm. You're responsible for that organization.
Yeah.
And yeah, human beings struggle with that level of discomfort
Mm-hmm.
that it takes to be in that role.
Yeah, you gotta be seeing a lot of that today, especially as businesses divest from their global operations because countries are becoming more like protective of their supply chain, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, supply chain, we could talk forever about supply chains. I mean, it's this idea of like, okay, we're just going to move supply chains out of China. And there are a lot of supply chains, no, you're not. Like
Mm-hmm.
medicine, for like cheaper medicine, you're
Right.
not that. And so the idea that we'll just move them all to Mexico, which is kind of what was originally the goal. Can't we just move our supply?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, look, you got to understand these leaders, particularly for these large technology companies, they have so many different variables stretching
Mm-hmm.
over both spatial and time, extended time frames, that human beings, I personally don't believe we're equipped to be able to, make decisions that far in the future.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think well about, we're not equipped to think about, like, say, deep time, like long term time frames. And you see it in climate change. I mean, even nationally, I mean, we're set into a 4-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that happens kind of has to happen in 4 years, because you don't know what the next guy's going to do.
Right.
And when you're facing global problems like, you don't want to call it the collapse of globalization,
Mm-hmm.
but although, some of my colleagues believe it is the collapse,
Yeah.
but a change of that sort of nature, or, climate change is really causing massive disruption around the world. It's hard to think in terms of, because they've got to make a report to their investors. It's hard to think in terms of like
Quarterly.
10, 20 years, 50 years. Yeah, they're all on quarter
Quarterly.
time frames.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that is for me one of the biggest obstacles for organizations is, how are you going to predict for a future that I'm telling you is fundamentally unknown, because
Mm-hmm.
we're in the future? How are you going to really rationalize those decisions? And how are you going to make tactical decisions that fit into a larger strategy
Right.
that does, stretch over a time frame that is usually outside of
Hmm.
what businesses are thinking, and
Yeah,
that is really complex.
I
Yeah.
imagine you run into the idea that okay, this problem is so far in the future, I'm not even going to be around. So let's have the next guy.
Exactly.
Let's have the next guy solve.
Exactly.
Let's deal with it.
That's the next guy's
Right?
problem. Yes,
Yeah.
100%. 100%. And they're not typically wrong.
Hmm.
It is the next guy's problem. And they have, shareholders that they have to please today.
Hmm.
And it's, I mean, it is a fundamental question of how our system is run, the capitalist system, and
Yeah.
with regard to what we're facing now, which is more existential global problems. How are we going to make those decisions when we're all focused on the nickels on the ground, as you say? Our
Yeah.
heads down, just trying to make it through the day,
Right.
and we're not focused in these long term strategies. And I don't have the answer for that.
Hmm.
I think in a general sense, I think it can be very organizational specific. Like you take like GM or Ford, they're saying, okay,
Hmm.
we're going to invest into this much into our EVs. Well, that is a commitment to the future,
Hmm.
and that you may believe that, and it may look very true that this sort of evolution is occurring in our automobile industry.
Hmm.
But questions start to become of like, well, what if the Democratic Republic of Congo dissolves into just a complete I don't know how to
Yeah.
say it could get more clear, but it just dissolves into anarchy, and you can't mine for the lithium anymore,
Hmm.
or it takes 10, 20 years to get a lithium mine in place, so they just hit a big find in the United States, but it's decade or more
Hmm.
away from being able to be utilized. Or what if China just decides they're no longer going to provide, or they're going to flood the market with some of these rare earths that they can currently
Hmm.
control? And each one of those decisions can change entire landscape
Right.
for business. And I think the pandemic, if there was anything that you could take away from the pandemic, is that is what an unintended, unknown consequence,
Exactly.
and that's the damage it can do.
Yep.
And then watching the human decision making because of it, and we're still dealing with it. We're going to be dealing with the decisions that were made during the pandemic for a long time. And could you have prepared for a pandemic? You probably should. Absolutely. Now, I mean, it's going to happen again.
Yeah.
I mean, probabilities say it will happen again. The question is,
Yeah.
how can we use
And now
these
you have a
lessons?
reference point, right?
Yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of the wrong lessons are being learned, and unfortunately, we have not seen a lot of continuity and global continuity into how are we going to, let alone national response of how are we going to respond to the next pandemic. All anyone can say is, I don't know how I'm going to respond, but I ain't wearing a mask. Yeah, okay, but what if the death rate is 20% of everyone who gets it?
Hmm.
You're not going to what we should have learned is something that only killed less than 1% of the folks who got it. Look what it did. Look how it disrupted an economy that for folks our age, I mean, it was like the weather.
Yeah.
The system ran, you had ups and downs. You tried not to go into depression, but here's the capitalist flood, work in, work out. And now you hear economists talk and really they're in the unknown. The numbers don't make sense to them. That what our economy now should not be our economy now. And so again, we're getting outside of the scope of what I think human beings can really understand. And that also draws in the conversation of, well, where does artificial intelligence play and its ability to understand the number of and extension of variables that leadership is having to determine, and how do leaders start to rely on that sort of capacity, because again, they need the timely and relevant information to be able to make decisions. They can't in their brain, they cannot contain all of the variables necessary to really balance the equation.
Right.
Which is again why they should bring in folks like myself and you. We're coming in with our areas of expertise to say, here's another layer of concern, here's another layer of logic, here's another approach, whatever it may be, for you to be able to make again better decisions based on the information you have at hand. Because that, at the end of the day, that's all we're trying.
Yeah, that's all we're doing, right? You came to us with a problem. We're here to help you make the right decision for yourself, for your organization, for your family.
Yeah, I saw it a lot in conflict zone development. So,
Mm-hmm.
as I said, I spent quite a few years in Guatemala doing development in conflict zones, and a lot of what I did was kind of a fixer role where you're working with different communities, trying to get, whether it's working with Save the Children, the Peace Corps,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get them into communities. So I did a lot of relationship building and that sort of thing in both a place called Rio Dulce, Guatemala, and a place called Namba, Guatemala, which is up
Mm-hmm.
in the northwestern highlands. And the reason I bring it up in this context is that, a lot of them are just, a lot of organizations are just kind of living day to day. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very much based on the money they have on hand and the problems that they can solve right now. And because there are so many problems, I mean, the first resource I ever saw was over firewood.
Wow.
So all the trees are chopped down. There's only so
Mm-hmm.
much firewood. Everybody's cooking their tortillas with wood.
Right.
You're about to have a fight.
Yeah.
And that's where it really dawned on me that, first of all, without security, you can't have development. And if there's no
Mm-hmm.
development, you have no security. And it's not just that simplistic, but it's a good heuristic and what to kind of approach the problem. And where Peace Corps would, or other organizations, I shouldn't throw them under the bus, they'd be having big conversations about, you should grow wasabi in
Mm-hmm.
your field because this is a higher, this makes more money on the open market.
Right.
And highland conditions are perfect. And the only other place is the mountains of Japan. And so these very long-term business deals, and they're like, man, if I don't sell enough of what I got right now, we're going to actually starve.
Mm-hmm.
And so the decisions are very stark. And so that's why I feel like I really understand that, hey, we have to make these decisions to survive. And yes, as we're doing with humanity and as a whole, we have to push back some of this long-term thinking because we won't make it.
Mm-hmm.
And in that really harsh environment, I really softened to the idea of, okay, then how do you listen to your client? How do you
Mm-hmm.
listen to that organization and say, hey, or the farmer in the highlands say, hey, I have to do this now. So you say, hey, what if we take 10% of your plot and we
Mm-hmm.
start growing this? We start researching what else you can grow. What if we, what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll lose 10% of my fine. Okay. How do we get you involved in international coffee so that you
Right.
can have it, because you do have coffee.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how can we get you access to more markets in your traditional market is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So I think that's the thing. You have to listen to your client. You have to recognize you may be thinking they're short-sighted, but they are for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Human nature, and
Yeah.
also because they know that they have to survive today. And again, it leads to this long-term problem of how are we going to solve these existential, or how are we going to answer these existential questions if by nature we're all focused on
Mm-hmm.
the short term. And I feel like that's something that just by having those conversations with your clients, just about by trying to draw them into, and again, paint the hedges for their future, you can have them even make better tactical decisions because over the long term,
Mm-hmm.
they'll survive now. And so you have to improve that situation for them, but also give them an opportunity to be here thriving in a decade or so. Because I think 10 years is about all we can really
Right.
think about, even in the long term. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Colby, we can talk about a lot of this stuff forever. I don't want to hold you back here, but
No, it was great.
yeah,
Thank you.
no, thanks for joining us today. And for you leaders out there, please reach out to Colby on your risk management, and at least open the conversation, right? If not for the leadership today, but for the leadership tomorrow.
Yeah. And thanks, Tony. And I think what I would pitch is I think that the hard part for me is to opening the aperture of the types of conversations I can have,
Mm-hmm.
the experts I can bring to bear. And so what I don't want is for leadership, a lot of times because it's lonely at the top, the question is who can I reach out to and
Mm-hmm.
trust, and who can support me in my decision making. And I always say to clients, hey man, just bring me a problem.
Right.
Check me out. Like let's work a problem together. I don't care what it is. Let's work a problem together. Get an idea of how I think, how I approach problem solving, and again, the resources I can bring to bear there.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we build that trust, we can start to really look how to improve your business continuity and your success rate. And at the end of the day, that's protect people and take advantage of opportunities. I think that's the key, obviously. So,
Yeah.
thanks for having me, Tony. I really appreciate it. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. We'll see you in the gym when
Awesome.
you get back here.
Oh yeah. I'll see you soon. In a gi, apparently. We're all doing gi now. So
I'm doing
gi. Awesome. All right, we'll give the boys a hug.
All right.
And thank you so much, sir.
All right. We'll see you
Later, brother.
Later.